In today's episode, my guest is Kelley Teahen, the Vice President of Communications and Marketing at Parachute. We discuss the Know What Impaired Means campaign, an initiative aimed at broadening the understanding of impairment beyond just drugs and alcohol. Kelley shares her insights on dangerous misconceptions among youth.
Not a majority, but a minority of those who have been surveyed thought that using cannabis actually helped them focus better, helped them improve in doing physical tasks, which translates into thinking that it doesn't mess you up when you're going to go drive.
Kelley also highlights the challenge of reaching a new generation with these messages.
We came up with the hashtag Know What Impaired Means because clearly there was a minority, but certainly a disturbing group who felt that using cannabis did not impair your ability to drive or to do much of anything else.
Kelley also touched on the evolving landscape of road safety and the importance of ongoing education and awareness campaigns.
We realized that we needed to get out of the way of the messaging because we're just considered to be so out of touch with cannabis culture as an organization where, as you said, we're old compared to this demographic.
She pointed out, emphasizing the need to adapt strategies to effectively reach younger audiences. Join us as we explore these vital topics and learn how we can all contribute to safer roads. Welcome to YD Drives the Future, a podcast where we cover all aspects of driver education and road safety. For over 50 years, Young Drivers of Canada has been dedicated to educating drivers of all skill levels and changing their driving behaviors for the safety of all road users. Let's jump into today's episode. Welcome to YD Drives the Future. Today, my guest is Kelley Teahen, the Vice President of Communications and Marketing at Parachute. Hi, Kelley. How are you today?
Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And today, let's talk about the Know What Impaired Means campaign. So tell me a little bit about the start of the campaign and its intention, and I'm sure that there'll be lots of things to carry forward from that.
Right. Well, this started initially with a study we'd seen from the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse and Addictions. And this was done in 2016, and it was a survey of teen attitudes around drug use. Remember, this was before legalization. But there were a number of interesting findings. One that really struck us was a finding around the fact that not a majority, but a minority of those who had been surveyed thought that using cannabis actually helped them focus better, helped them improve in doing physical tasks, which translates into thinking that it doesn't mess you up when you're going to go drive. So we did a little mini campaign in 2017 based on that and several other sort of little findings out of that survey. And we had a sort of fact and fiction. We had fiction, a result from the survey, and fact, this is not true. This is, in fact, here's the statistic. We put this out, a little bit of social media push, and we just got trounced. We got mocked, derided because it was aimed at a youth demographic who were saying, what do you know? And it's true. It's a cannabis culture. It's a youth culture. And we were kind of like, what was it all about? So we kind of regrouped and thought, well, this is not the way to promote this kind of message. So in 2018, we just did a little whiteboard video about, we got a little funding from the Ministry of Transportation Ontario, and as part of our National Teen Driver Safety Week that year, we did a video and some supporting social media around, and we came up with the hashtag Know What Impaired Means, because clearly there was a minority, but certainly a disturbing group who felt that using cannabis did not impair your ability to drive or to do much of anything else. So we did that and applied for a larger program through the Substance Use and Addictions Program at Health Canada. We are now at the end of 2018, and cannabis has become legal. So the federal government thought, you know what, all of us have to change our messaging, because before 2018, how did you combat drug driving? You said, drugs illegal, drugs bad, don't do drugs, and don't drive while you do drugs.
Right.
Now, you can't say it's illegal. That's not the reason.
That's off the
Why?
table now.
Yeah. So we started looking, of course, at the messaging that had been used around alcohol impaired driving, which had been legal for, of course, for many years. And how does that compare? Again, of course, we still see young people who are driving drunk or impaired in that way, but there is sort of an ethos that is like, yeah, that's not cool, man. Shouldn't drive while you're drunk. Well, how do we get to that stage at least with cannabis? So we got funding to do a significant campaign that was Know What Impaired Means, focusing on that crux question. You make up your own mind about this, but understand that you're in no shape to drive. And
Right.
understand if you're a passenger that you shouldn't be getting in a car with somebody who drives. Because we did a survey through academic group of young Canadians 16 to 24. And we found the following facts. So almost 20% of those people surveyed with a license had reported driving within 4 hours using cannabis. 53% believe it's safe to drive less than 5 hours after using. And
Right.
this was the one that was a little disturbing. More than a third of the people surveyed had reported riding in a vehicle with somebody who was impaired by cannabis.
Well, it's interesting
And that,
because typically the word impair or being impaired is often related directly to drugs or alcohol. And
mhm,
and so the information you're providing certainly isn't alarming to me, but
yeah,
it may very well be alarming to and the fact that it like to me there are many other things that can impair someone, right? Impair their ability to drive or make decisions or what have you. But let's go down that path a little bit later.
mhm. Well, when we looked at this, I mean, the one thing that the survey showed us, which we had not thought of and was not a part of our original map for how we were going to roll this
Right.
out, was that concern around passengers.
Yeah.
Because not only had they been in these situations, the same number, about a third, didn't feel that they could ask somebody who was under the influence not to drive. So there was we wanted to, and what we ended up doing in our approach was that our first campaign on Know What Impaired Means really focused in a way on that sort of sense of the passenger. And we came up with two scenarios we had called Skydiver, and the two ads or two public service announcements, Skydiver and a rock climber. So these were two people who were doing something physically challenging for the first time. And the person who was to ensure their safety, the person packing the parachute, and in the other case, the person who was holding the safety line in the rock
Right.
climbing appeared to be stoned. And so,
Right.
would you trust somebody to hold your safety line if they're stoned? Why would you get in a car with them?
Yeah.
Know what impaired means. So we really swung our focus to look at that issue of passengers as well as the drivers. For the driver focus, we had a series of shorter videos that were produced for social media. They were also shared on what they call the Campus Resto Network, which is we got donated space from one of the out of home agencies to have these play in the bathrooms and
Right.
in places where Campus Resto Bar circuit
Mhm.
that has the short videos of, you know, would you, it was kind of like, would you do this if you're high? Then why would you drive? So they were very funny scenarios. Somebody
Right.
trying to assemble a bike and it turning out wrong. Somebody going to wax their eyebrows and they ended up making a real hash of it because they were.
Right.
So using humor
Right.
was a big part of this. They're very funny spots because we certainly learned through experience that nagging does not work. Doom and
No,
gloom
but
does not work.
I'm having a flashback, and I mean, I'm old and been in this industry for 30 plus years, and I'm thinking back to campaigns that were run. Friends don't let friends, right? You
Yes.
remember friends don't let
Yep.
friends
Let
drink and
friends
drive,
drive. Yeah.
right? Yeah, and it's like, oh my gosh, the demographic that we're dealing with now wasn't didn't get that campaign, like the youth of today didn't get that messaging, right? From, the time that they were preteen through their teens,
Mhm.
because that message just doesn't exist anymore.
Well, we certainly have been keeping up what we can through the work at Parachute in Canada on
Yeah,
this. This campaign was part of a longer journey. We certainly had those initial ads. It got a lot of attention too because the agency we worked with had this clever idea to come up with a lit sculpture
right,
that was installed at the CNE. So a bit of an attention getter to kick off the
right.
campaign. And what it had was the words high, bombed, ripped, baked, lit, red-eyed, stoned, and doped up. But the way it aligned, the letters in red created the word impaired. So this was something
Ah,
that we had at the CNE, and then later it was transferred for National Teen Driver Safety Week in 2019 to Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. So while it was
right.
only, it was such a large thing that we couldn't take it around the country by any means, but we were able to have it displayed in a couple of places in Toronto, and it drew good crowds, and people would photograph and they would go, oh, call it what you want, just don't drive impaired.
Right,
If you think you're ripped, you're impaired. If you think you're lit, you're impaired. So
right.
we got a lot of people who would come. It was a great place for kind of that selfie culture, take a picture. Also, an important part of this campaign is we did not brand it as coming from Parachute. We
Okay.
created separate social media accounts called Know What Impaired Means. If people wanted more information when they clicked on that, then they would come to the Parachute website. But
Right.
we realized that we needed to get out of the way of the messaging because we're just considered to be so out of touch with the cannabis culture as an organization. We're, as you said, we're old compared to this demographic, and
Yep.
they're really
Yep.
not trusting of authority. Also, too, I think there was a bit of an effect because we were moving into a period of legalization in Canada. There had been such a lobbying effort in 2017, 2016, 2017, leading to
Right.
2018, to say that cannabis is relatively harmless, that alcohol is worse for you, that it is, there was so much evidence being put forward to support the legalization of cannabis that it really created an atmosphere where the risks of cannabis largely got swept aside, at least for a while. I think we're starting to see some of that come back into the conversation now,
Mm-hmm.
but we had a real sense of, and probably because there's also a lot more conversation these days about the risk of alcohol, not
Right.
just for impairment in driving, but in general health terms. So, what are the long-term effects of cannabis use? We don't have the amount of detailed studies that we do related to alcohol. But so I think that was part of the atmosphere of this time
Right.
was, trying to say, hey, yes, it's legal. Yes, it's cool. We're not going to tell you not to smoke up. We're not going to tell you not to eat an edible. That's not going to come from us. But we will tell you if you choose to do those things, there are other choices you need to make around keeping people safe.
It's interesting again, like, thinking back, again, I'm old enough to remember cigarette commercials being on television and on the back of magazines and in newspapers, right? And then, it went from cigarettes to booze, and now cigarettes have kind of, sort of fallen off the map, and now we're dealing with booze and weed. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, why is it so important for I'm not gonna limit this to young people. I'm just gonna say, why is it important for folks to understand what impaired actually means? Like, why is that mission
Why is this
critical?
such a bad idea to drive stoned high, or as you mentioned earlier, zombie tired, which it's like, that's okay. I'll keep the windows open. I'll play the music loud. I'll be fine. Driving a car, and they are now much bigger. I've always used the term 2 ton, but given the size of vehicles these days, it's even more than that. You are driving, I'm quite vehement about this, that, you're driving a 2 ton killing machine when
Hmm.
you're at the wheel. You can kill somebody with this thing, unfortunately, way too easily. If you're not under control, if you're not paying attention every second, if you lose your attention, and even somebody who is completely sober and well rested can still have a moment
Hmm.
where something goes wrong, which is where all the
Hmm.
Vision Zero safe systems approach comes in, that when that moment happens, let's have the roads designed in such a way that you won't harm somebody else if you have that moment of inattention. But how do we get people to understand? Well, there's study after study after study of what happens to your ability to focus. What happens, your reaction time is a huge thing, that your reaction time, you
Big
just
one.
don't,
Yeah.
you're not just on it right away. And that those few seconds between proper reaction time and one that is impaired can mean the difference, literal life and death difference for another human being.
Well, yeah. And if you're traveling at 50 kilometers an hour, 44 meters every second counts, right? It could mean the difference between stopping for that object or person that's in the roadway versus not stopping for that object or person that's in the roadway. And, while again, the connection is often made between impairment and driving. It's not just driving, it's impairment and doing anything that requires concentration or fine motor skills. That could be riding your lawnmower. It could be driving your e-bike. It could be on your scooter or even your skateboard, for heaven's sakes. Do you know what I mean? It's not, the effects aren't just negative when you're behind the wheel, right?
That is true, but the consequences are worse. If you are, for instance, if you are on the skateboard and you're kind of out of control, you may have a fall and you may injure yourself. You might bump and bruise somebody else, but you're not going to impact them with 2 tons of vehicle. So
agreed. But now, nowadays
why...
scooters and skateboards are often found in the same laneways as traffic in many places, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, a
Sure,
road user is a road users, right?
Yeah, it puts the driver, if you will, of that smaller, what is the proper name now? I'm losing track of the name of these small motorized vehicles, mobility vehicles that are not cars, but they are small motorized. So that in a relatively new class of vehicles that's out there, we're still trying to figure out as a society what to do with them. Where do they go? Are they allowed to go on the bike lane? Do they go on the main road with the traffic? What are the speed limits? What are the restrictions as we come up with these different things? But looping back to that, the campaign at the time, we were focusing on drivers of traditional vehicles in traditional roadways.
Right.
And another aspect of the campaign was that we also wanted to reach out to parents or teachers, people who influence young people, because we have discovered through our surveying research over the years that despite what you might think, if you're a parent, your kids actually do listen to you. You may not think so sometimes at the time, but they are paying attention and they will take what you say to them seriously. So we did create a second campaign that ran in 2020. We ran Know What Impaired Means again, but then in 2020, we did a campaign called Have This Talk.
Right.
And 2020 and 2021, the idea was to have this talk. And again, we used humor, situations where a parent and a child, and the parent is the young person in the public service announcement, the actor is playing a young person who's thinking, oh, this is so embarrassing. They're going to talk to me about sex. I really don't want to be here. But what we're going to have the talk about is driving high.
Right.
Do you think I was going to talk about?
Yep.
So it's this, the idea of let's use, again, humor to drive the point home that this is something you need to talk to your kids about, this, because you might not have even done so before legalization, thinking that the talk was don't do drugs because it's illegal. Now it's like, well, okay, this is a legal substance, so let's talk about how you use it responsibly.
Right.
Including related to driving.
I want to take us down a slightly different path here, using your background and your, the information from your campaign and my background and all of the information that I've accumulated in the past 30 plus years. And this is a bit of a loaded question, and some might call it controversial, and I'm going to go off book here just a little bit. Are we ever not impaired when we're behind the wheel? Because listen, the definition of being impaired, what is it now? To make less by strengthening value, quantity, or quality, right? Is sort of the dictionary definition. And so
Okay.
that
Well,
means,
only a
that if
researcher
I'm not,
should come up with a term like that. That's
yeah,
this is
and
like a
I
very
remember that being in all the material that I used in class for, a bazillion years. And the idea is, am I ever not? Do you know what I mean? Like can we maintain that 100% hyper focus the entire time we're behind the wheel? Or is there um uh an amount of impairment that is manageable, right? And like, listen, I know that this is like going way out there, but I mean, the legal blood alcohol concentration for booze isn't zero unless you're a new driver, right?
Mhm.
The legal a definition of being impaired by cannabis is not anything over zero, right? So there's something in there that says, well, there's a range, and I'm thinking about, we talked about, being zombie tired, right? What's the definition between, oh my gosh, I'm so exhausted. Should I be driving home? Like, are we ever not impaired? Do you know what I mean? Know what impaired means, but what does it mean to me? I know that there are certain situations where I shouldn't drive. I'm tired. I can barely keep my eyes open. I can't even think about what my first name is and how to spell it. I should not be behind the wheel of the car. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Professionally, for me, it is zero, right? My blood alcohol concentration, or THC, 0, 0, 0, 0, whatever, that's the way, that's my definition for me because of what I'm doing. But,
Mhm.
are we ever not impaired?
Well, that is, as you say, an individual question. Our job, both as educators around this topic and also as individuals trying to be responsible in terms of how you are on the road, is to mitigate those risks of impairment. So, know what are the obvious risks. The obvious risks are, as we know, alcohol, drugs, pretty well advertised what the alcohol is. And that 0.08, I think from the way it's been described to me, it's a relatively political decision. It's what the traffic will bear.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, should we have a blood alcohol level of 0? I believe so. You should not have drunk and been
Mm-hmm.
behind the wheel, full stop. But to try to get that through legislation would be very difficult. So it is the art of the possible currently. It may change in years to come.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with cannabis, the testing is not there with the kind of precision level that you get with blood alcohol in terms of
Right.
that kind of parts per million and legal definition. So that is a challenge for the enforcement folks to figure out just how do we measure that and determine impaired driving, at least in a legal definition, for those who are using drugs, and particularly cannabis, as a legal substance. So yes, what can we do as drivers? We, as much as possible, remove those, whether it's distractions, whether it's knowing your own body and knowing when you're tired, uh, knowing that if there are alternate transportations you can take. Now, we found this out too, working on a campaign like this, is that we have to approach things differently sometimes if we're speaking to youth who live in rural areas as opposed to youth who live in urban centers. It's fine to
Mm-hmm.
say, take transit, call an Uber. Yeah, well, if
Yeah.
you're living
Yeah.
in Yickety Yakmuk,
Yeah.
Saskatchewan, there is
Yep.
neither transit nor Uber. It's essentially if
Right.
you can convince your mom to come and pick you up, or you sleep on the
Right.
floor of your friend's place. Uh, so there's not an equal opportunity to avoid an instance of making the decision on the wrong side of the question
Right.
when you are in a remote or rural area. So that is something for all of us just to consider. We often think, well, just take transit, take a cab, take an Uber,
Yep.
instead
Yep.
of getting behind the wheel when you are impaired in any fashion. But it is
Right.
more difficult when you live in an area that relies on, private motor vehicle transportation
Right.
as really the only means you have of getting around.
I'm from that rural area. I spent almost 25 years working for young drivers in Kenora, Ontario, and we didn't have public transit that ran 24
Mm.
hours. We didn't have Ubers. Getting a taxi was not something that you wanted to do from the gravel pit to your house, which was in a very rural area. So it went back to the conversations that happened between the parents and the new drivers, right? Because that was my area.
Mhm.
And, the conversation that happened before that, look, we know what we did when we were young, right? We're not anticipating that you're going to be any different, but, here are the things you need to think about, that there's much bigger consequences. So why, with all of this messaging and with, it's almost like seat belts, and I hate to bring them up again, but cigarettes and booze, everybody knows that drinking and driving is, not a good thing. I mean, there's enough PR out there that says being high and driving is not a good thing. Why are people still doing it?
Why is the grass green?
Yeah.
there, there tends to be, first of all, if we look who's doing it, and the age ranges are surprising, because one of the things that we discovered was that we thought, initially this was really more of a problem with the younger set of drivers, but in 2021, we had some further information from the National Cannabis Studies that showed that between the ages of 25 and 49, there had been an upswing in driver fatalities involving cannabis impairment. So it wasn't just the kids, it was
It's not the youngins anymore. No.
an older group. So we did develop a secondary campaign that was targeted specifically at saying, using that milieu now of the stores being open, and there you go in and it's like a little fancy boutique, and you pick, this is for sleep, and this is for this, and this is for creativity, and then, but there's no cannabis for driving. So that was kind of
Right.
the idea that you can use, you can do this, do that, that's fine, but cannabis and driving, doesn't mix. So it is a larger age range. Human beings are just, oftentimes it's not about me. I'm other people maybe, but I'm fine. Or they simply just, at that moment in their life, don't give a darn.
Right.
They're out, they're having a good time. I'm fine. I'm going to get in the car. Not a problem. So it does tend to be, it is a little on the selfish side. It's about what's easiest for me in the moment, as opposed to thinking of how my actions might affect other people. So
Right.
that's a lack of empathy in general, which is something we see a lot of, unfortunately, in our society. So that lack of empathy is part of that decision making process that says, I need to get home. I'm going to get in the car. We're
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
It's or I can handle it. It's that sort of macho, in some cases, a more macho attitude around, I'm fine. No problems with
But
me.
it's like playing the lottery. Eventually your number's going to come up, right? Eventually. That's my thought anyway. Eventually I'm going to win the lottery. But there was some statistics that were bantered about that talked about, by the time an impaired driver is actually caught, they have driven impaired many more times. That it would
It's
be
a
very
habit.
unusual, right? Yeah.
It's a
And
habit. It's
and
the mindset, and we've seen circumstances, and these are rare cases, but the person who has been arrested and charged and convicted, and they have their license suspended, and they may have even served time, like the hardcore people. And then that same person is caught again. They're driving without a license, because at that point it's moving into almost a criminal mindset. It's like, well,
yep.
the law does not apply to me.
Right.
And part
Right.
of it is, I think
It's
we do look upon driving in our culture as a right and not a privilege.
I think that's
We
that.
look
I think
upon,
that's a loaded statement right there, right? I mean, it's yeah, no, I get it.
I
And I
get
mean,
to
how many
drive.
YouTube videos have you watched with regard to someone who has a suspended driver's license driving to their hearing?
Yeah.
I watched one the other day where the court was being held on video, right? So on a Zoom or something like that type
Mhm.
platform, and the person was in the car, and the judge said, "Are you driving?" And the person says, yeah, I had to, go and do such and such. And the judge is just shaking their head.
Yep.
It's so speaking of driving, let's talk about the other part, the friends don't let friends. So
Mhm.
how do we change, what do we do as responsible adults, as responsible folks in this industry, to get the message out that, number one, it's not okay to let friends drive high or drunk or impaired by anything, right? But number two, that it's not a good idea for us to get in the car with them either, right? How do we get
Mhm.
that message out without coming across like we're pointing our finger and saying, don't do this?
Our approach has been to use humor, because if people can kind of chuckle in self-recognition at something, if there's some sense of it being, I mean, it's a very serious topic. I
Very,
grant you that, but there is a way of doing it where we are setting it up in such a way that there's a humor to it. It really is effective. I don't know if you've ever seen the Melbourne Transport Authority video I think it's called 100 Ways to Die. It's the funniest
no,
little video, and it's these little characters at the very end. What it's meant to do, it's asking people not to stand right near the edge of when the train comes in, because that's
Mhm.
one of the dumb ways to die. 100 Dumb Ways to Die is the name of the song. But it's this little animated illustrations, and it so drives that point home. It won all kinds of awards, and it's several years old now. But, I think it's the gold standard of how we communicate. We take something that is very serious, but we make it engaging in a way that people will actually watch the little video and will hang around to the end to see how it ends, because it's either cute, it's engaging, it's got humor, it's got the messages there, but we
right.
absolutely know that finger wagging and nagging and even the shock tactic, the we've seen lots of this, the pictures
Even
of
that
the
doesn't work anymore.
the
No,
crash. It never really has. What it does is it upsets people at the time, but we've seen the studies that show if you go a year out from something like that, it hasn't changed how people thought.
right.
So it's shocking at the time, the blood and gore approach, where you're saying, look what happens if you do this, and there's, blood spatters everywhere and somebody dying on the
Yep.
road. Uh, Shocking, yes. People may look away, yes. It doesn't change their mind. Sometimes you do hear from, if you present these things, maybe in a longer form. Like, for instance, we often have heard of where there's speakers who have been, whether they were a drunk driver themselves or injured
Right.
in a car crash, and they will speak in high schools and they will talk about how this injury impacted their life. There may be more of a personal connection there, where you have that kind of talk, and the students may be affected by that to think twice before they do something in the future. But just a little quick 30-second car crash video isn't going to have the kind of
No, I
effectiveness it
mean,
will.
again, I'm old. I've been through several graduating seasons, and we're right in the midst now of a graduation season. And somewhere, someplace, a graduate is going to die because of an impairment and driving related situation, right?
Mm.
And that school is going to remember that graduate for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the memory fades and everything kind of goes back to it's normal. It may be a different normal, but it's still normal, where some of the, the shock, the sadness, the grief, the what everybody went through just kind of diminishes.
Well, how do we then keep those lights going, and also to say that these kind of mindset changes are very long-term projects. You have mentioned yourself, smoking and seatbelts. It took decades
Mm-hmm.
to get those to a point where, and we still have people who won't use seatbelts. If we look at the statistics of fatalities, where the
Right.
driver was not wearing a seatbelt,
Wearing a
significantly higher
seatbelt.
percentage, overrepresented in the
Right.
fatality statistics. Some people still aren't wearing seatbelts, even though everybody knows that it makes total sense to do so. Why is that? When you look at things like, and we've been talking about impaired driving, we know that even though it's unacceptable, it still happens. We know the effects of smoking, people still smoke. A much smaller percentage, and we've made it far more difficult for people to smoke
Right.
in our society, and we've removed the risk to other people through secondhand smoke by banning smoking in
Right.
public spaces. So we've gone a long way, but it's incremental. And
Mm-hmm.
it'll be 2 steps forward and then maybe there'll be a step back, but we just
Yep.
have to keep at it. It's not something where we can go, "Magic wand, this is the perfect campaign." Suddenly, everybody is going to sit up and
Yeah.
say,
No.
"Oh, I have seen the
Gosh.
light. I will not
Gosh.
ever do this ever again." And it's always
Don't
it's a
we
new group
wish?
of people. It's a new group of people. You're working with young
Yep.
drivers, and this
Yep.
is a new group of people. Every 2, 3
Yep.
years, you've got another set coming in.
Well, and attitudes change, right? I mean, attitudes change, people change, society changes, and messaging that worked 10 years ago doesn't work today. And gosh, even messaging that worked 3 years ago in some cases doesn't work today. Kelley, what's coming up in the future for Parachute and campaigns in this vein, or other exciting projects that you've got going on?
Well, Parachute as a charity does work in several areas, not just in road safety. We work on all of the major causes of death by injury in Canada. So also
Mhm.
falls and poisonings. But in terms of our work in road safety, we are currently partnering with Hugo Hull, who is he's a professional cyclist. He's from Quebec. And he unfortunately had the tragedy in his family of his brother Pierre being killed by a driver in Quebec. His brother, I believe, was 18, 19 years old, and he was hit by a driver and killed. So Hugo has paired with us to do some awareness videos about why he supports Vision Zero, which is simply a commitment in road safety that the only acceptable number of deaths on our roads is zero. So what
Zero.
we can we do to achieve that using a safe systems approach, which means we build putting the human first, not the speed of transportation first in our agenda. And that's a big, big, big mind shift. We are seeing, interestingly enough, that when we do polling and when we look at this, that there is a greater support among young people for some of the measures related to Vision Zero, like slower speed, speed limits enforced and lower speeds.
Mhm.
So I think we're going to see, I hope, an evolution that as this generation comes forward, also for environmental reasons, they're less in love with the car-centric culture than the generations that have preceded them. So we may see over time a greater mind shift. So a lot of our work right now is doing Vision Zero. We use the hashtag change for good roads. And we define good roads
Right.
as being not just roads that get you someplace, a car driver, someplace fast from A to B, but good roads that are good roads for all. Whether you are a pedestrian, a cyclist, a driver, somebody who's running a business, somebody who's raising a family in that neighborhood, that is a good
Right.
road for all of you.
Great. That's so exciting. I'm looking forward to reaching Vision Zero, although it probably won't happen in my lifetime. I'm excited to see the steps that we take along the way. Kelley, thank you so much for joining us today at YD Young Drivers Drives the Future. I would love to have you back as a guest again, and we can go into again some more of these controversial statements and some of the things that are fiction rather than fact, and get other people talking about it too. So our guest today has been Kelley Teahen from Parachute. She is the Vice President of Communications and Marketing. Thanks for joining us today, and let's use your hashtag to close the episode. And do you know what impaired means?
Yes,
Kelley, have a
know what
wonderful
impaired
day.
means, and also let's go for change for good roads.
Excellent. Thanks again. Have a wonderful day.